Good morning, everyone. I'm Tessa Joels, president of the Center for Media Literacy, and I'm here to welcome you to the NATO Center for Media Literacy webinar series. It's a 6-part series devoted to the topic of resilience through media literacy. And today we have a wonderful panel of speakers for you who are going to address the notion of news literacy and how to empower global citizens in a new information age. So we'll start today. I will introduce our speakers, and then we'll start today with Barbora Maronkova. And she is an established public diplomacy expert with over 15 years of experience in NATO. She currently serves as the program officer with Public Diplomacy Division and acts as the communication advisor on NATO's strategic concept at the Policy Planning Unit of the Office of the Secretary General. We also have Alice Huguet, who is an education policy researcher and co-director of the Center for Quantitative and Mixed Methods at the RAND Corporation. She also is an education researcher. Her research explores a variety of topics, including media literacy, evidence-based decision-making, and social and emotional learning, among others. We also have Dr. Philip Seib, who is Professor Emeritus of Journalism and Public Diplomacy at the University of Southern California. His most recent book is Information at War: Journalism, Disinformation, and Modern Warfare. So we welcome our speakers, and let's get started with Barbora.
Thank you very much. Good morning or afternoon from Brussels, from Belgium. And thank you very much for having me together with, I believe, other colleagues who will be joining the other webinars. And we are very delighted that NATO's Public Diplomacy Division is both participating and also a partner of these webinars. I'll probably start with few thoughts that I'll just throw out there based on my experience working for an international organization like NATO, and also present perhaps a couple of thoughts what we as an organization are doing, what we are not doing, and perhaps what we could be recommended to do also based on this webinar. First of all, I think I will borrow Phil's title of his most recent book, which I'm sure everybody has read, and if they have not done that, they should. Because I think we are actually living in an era of information war, both domestically, but also internationally. Information becomes an instrument of power, influence, but also war. We have to say from the outset that this is nothing new for the warfare. The deception has been used for centuries. But what I believe we are witnessing is that rarely has it impacted so many people so fast at the same time. And obviously the technology has clearly helped this situation. I think there are no more filters. Before, for centuries, you would have perhaps oral narrators, you had the word of mouth. Later, with the invention of modern journalism, you had the journalists. So you always had some sort of gatekeepers, some filters, but we don't have that anymore. And it's perhaps both good and bad, because everything is never black and white, truly. What I think we see and we continue seeing is how both the social media, so as a platform, but also citizen journalism, has alerted millions of people around the globe to events happening on the other side of the planet. They help to raise awareness, they help to promote the cause. And a great example, I think, we have been seeing for the past 9 months from the Ukrainians and how they have been amply using social media to draw attention to the war and to their cause and garner support. But we're also witnessing the opposite. We see deliberate manipulation of information, outright lies. And the social media have helped to create echo chambers. And unfortunately, also the modern structure of media ownership and media groups has also increased this gap and aided to the polarization. So I see ourselves living in a moment that, as Peter Pomerantsev, a British author of Russian origin, called a few years ago in his book, "Nothing is true and everything is possible." So what can be done? I think we have identified the problem. I think we have spent the last 10 years studying disinformation. How is it created? How is it promulgated? What impact it might have? So now I believe we need to find solutions. I think that we need a complex approach to this because I see it as a part of the broader societal resilience. It's an interlinkage of various tools, instruments, and disciplines that we need to bring together, from education to promotion of independent journalism, and to borrow from disciplines such as sociology, psychology, and many others. But I would argue that the most important ingredient that we need to start with is to rebuild the trust. We need to rebuild the trust of citizens in our political systems, in our economic, social structures and norms, but also into the international norms. So basically a way of life that we know, that we enjoy, but somehow we came to question. For NATO, as an organization, we play our own role, or at least we try to contribute. But obviously our role is limited to our mandate as a political military organization and as an intergovernmental organization. So obviously we cannot substitute roles or responsibilities of individual governments and other actors. But what we can do, I believe, as NATO is to use our convening power of political consultations, where we have 30, soon 32 member states and a huge network of partner countries from the outskirts of the Euro-Atlantic area all the way to the Middle East, Northern Africa, and the global partners all the way in Asia Pacific. And we do this, we use this convening power to raise awareness about the impact of disinformation and what it means. We also have included disinformation and the dangers it poses to our society into our overall counter-hybrid warfare strategy approach. And we are looking at enhancing both our collective resilience as well as national resilience of our member states by providing them with guidance on minimum requirements, including on disinformation and healthy information space. We have a lot of partnerships. I already mentioned that there are many countries with whom we cooperate, but there are also other organizations. Most importantly for us being based in Belgium is the European Union, because majority of the member states of European Union are also NATO member states. So we coordinate, we share information, best practices, we consult each other, both formally and informally. Here, I would also stress the importance of engaging with the private sector and many other organizations that are focusing on detecting disinformation, analyzing the information environment, and alerting us and helping us to figure out what's happening and what could be the possible responses. So I believe over the past 10 years, we have created our own ecosystem of partners. I call them the truth warriors. with whom we really work almost on a daily basis. And here within NATO structures, the public diplomacy division is the key player in this regard. That's our mandate. We work with civil society and different other organizations to promote the topic, also through different grants. And one of the grants ended up with us having this webinar. We also have advanced our own strategic communication capabilities, and we improved our information environment assessment so that we know what is happening in the information sphere, both in our own member states, but also our adversaries. We use our large network of government communicators from our member states and closest partners to keep each other informed and advance proactive communication about NATO and our policies and decisions. So we can be out there with factual information before our adversaries do and try to shape the message. And last but not least, and here I'm coming more to the topic of our discussion today, is the role of our press team and our press office, which works day and night to get out the information from NATO on a timely manner and accurately, and work with our fellow journalists from around the world. It's not just about giving the journalists the information, here is a press release, thank you very much, but it's also about building relationships with them, working on background briefings, in a way, if I may use this word, educating them, because some of our topics are extremely complex and technical, and we understand that journalists, especially these days, have to cover so much and so many topics. So in order to help them, we really sit down and do background briefings, expert briefings for them to build their knowledge. So I think this is our way in contributing to increase information awareness about NATO, and also using our partners to put it out there. We also believe that the citizens can and surely do play an important role in this regard. That's why we invest a lot of time and energy speaking at public events, engaging with young people, bringing them to the NATO headquarters. These days, it's really hard to get a cup of coffee because there are huge lines in the cafeteria because we have so many visitors, we can't fit them in anymore, but it's great. It's good to see the interest of people to come to NATO, to speak with us. And we believe by providing this sort of information, they can help us to multiply this message. So it's a pretty complex operation. I think we worked pretty hard over the past decade and even more to get where we are today. But of course, much more still needs to be done. So I think I'm going to stop here. It was a few remarks to kick us off, and I'm looking forward to the comments and discussion, and I'm happy to elaborate more. Thank you.
Thank you. Alice.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Barbora, for that. That was a really excellent sort of summary of the work you're doing, and I'm so excited to get to be here and talk with you more about that. So my name is Alice Huguet. I'm a policy researcher at the RAND Corporation, and I focus on kindergarten through 12th grade education policy. So I mentioned that as a bit of a caveat because convenings like this are very important. We're bringing together this different kind of expertise, as is the convening role that intergovernmental organizations like NATO play, but I'm offering a very specific perspective, which is that my research is typically in the US education policy context. So I'm really excited about learning more about the international work that everyone has been doing. So it's pretty specific, and I'm going to be using my work in the US as a point of reference, but I do think that there are some common themes that we can pull from that discussion and apply to other countries and organizations as well. So as I mentioned, I work at the RAND Corporation, and RAND has something called the Truth Decay Initiative, which was really my entree into studying media literacy. And we could think about truth decay terminology as sort of shorthand for communicating the phenomena of increased disagreement about facts and data, a blurring of the line between opinion and fact, and declining trust in formerly respected and trusted institutions. And at RAND, we're looking at this problem from many angles, which is one of our benefits. We have multiple different kinds of departments and researchers working in different disciplines. So we're exploring tools and governance mechanisms to address the spread of false information, and we're thinking about how to revitalize civic infrastructure. And where I come in is that we're also thinking about civic and media education, among other approaches. And before I delve in further, I just want to say that I'm going to be using terms like media literacy, information literacy, and news literacy throughout the conversation. I do recognize these are different things, and I think the terminology really does matter. But for the purpose of our conversation today, I just want to level up the discussion to thinking about these strands of literacy as educational approaches to curbing the spread of misinformation and disinformation. And I don't want to give the impression that I'm sort of conflating these different constructs. So what I wanted to speak about today are three really questions that I don't have answers to, but I'm really eager to hear other people's thoughts on. My first question is, at what level should governments and institutions, intergovernmental institutions even, be making policies about news and media literacy? One thing that I have learned from my research in media literacy is that policies related to this in the US are very scattershot. And by that, I mean that they look different from state to state, and they don't even exist in all states. And I know that it varies across countries, even within NATO member nations. As Tessa's recent report really highlighted, there's a variety of different approaches to media literacy and approaches in our different countries. So for us in my research, our surveys have shown that this can mean some educators are receiving supports and training for media literacy instruction, while others don't receive any at all. And it varies not only at the state, but the district and school levels as well. What's concerning about that is that often when we have this kind of variation in policy, students in schools that are minoritized or of a lower income are often left behind. So what we've found from our research is that the barriers to media literacy education are more salient for teachers who are working in some of our lower income schools. So when we have this kind of scattershot approach, one challenge related to that is that it can actually become an equity issue where some people are getting access to education and information and others are not. So what do we do about that? Should news and media literacy curriculum be mandated at a district level? Should decisions be made at a state level? Should there be a national mandate that requires, some form of news, media, or information literacy instruction, but leaves those choices about how and what is taught to states themselves? I think these are questions that we're grappling with in the US. I do think that a lot of variation in how media and news literacy is taught is warranted, because learners, whether they're students in schools or adults, learners in one corner of the country have very different needs than learners in another part of the country, as is in the world. But I also know, and I think we all agree here, that the last several decades have really solidified to us that generally media, news, and information literacy are critical priorities across the board. So that sort of complicates this idea of leaving policies and decisions up to smaller governing bodies. So that's an open question for me. At what level should we be making these policies? The variation in contexts are vast. So how much of it do we think should be similar across organizations, states, countries, and how much of it should be dictated by a sort of a broader blanket policy? So that also connects to my second question, which is a little bit more in the weeds with media literacy, and that is, what would empowerment policies look like as related to media, news, and information literacy? So saying that citizens are the first line of defense against information warfare is true. It simply is. Citizens are the targets and often the perpetrators of malign information, depending on the situation we're discussing. But even that framing that citizens are the defense against something, it seems to exclusively imply a protectionist approach to media, news, and information literacy. So great thinkers of media literacy, including Tessa here, Renee Hobbs of the Media Education Lab, and many others, they often think about two camps or two approaches to the subject. One is protectionist, one is empowerment. A protectionist approach, to be very brief about it, views media literacy mostly as a way to counteract negative influences in the media and information ecosystem, while empowerment perspectives are more participatory and recognize learners more as active creators and collaborators in that ecosystem. So we can see how saying that citizens are a first line of defense can conjure images of protectionism, but it is very important to keep that in mind because it is true. We need our citizens to better understand how to interact in the ecosystem. So it's also true that when we think about policy as a defense against mis and disinformation, we are also thinking from a protectionist standpoint. So for instance, policies might limit certain types of speech on certain platforms or require tech companies to better regulate the information that's passing through their gates or require fact checking. There's a place for these more protectionist levers, absolutely. But I'm also interested in thinking about how we can also empower citizens to be participants in the information ecosystem in a way that doesn't just program them to be on the lookout for malign information, but also encourages them to contribute in a way that doesn't leave news and media literacy in a place that feels only fear motivated. So that's a question I think about a lot. What does empowerment news or media literacy policy actually look like? How can policies be designed with an eye toward individuals' contributions to the information environment as much as their self and societal protection, which are of utmost importance? And I think this is complicated because nuance can be very difficult to preserve in a public arena, such as a policymaking arena. And of course, all of this is assuming that policy, governments and institutions have a role to play in this work. So I want to back up with my final question, which perhaps might lead into our conversation. What role should institutions and governments play in addressing the current information environment, if any? I do think they have a role. I think most of us do. So I'm curious about how we see it. And I'm especially interested in hearing from people who have experience outside of the United States. What do different organizations see their role as? Like most of the good questions in life, I don't have an answer. It's simply a question to pose. So I'm very eager to discuss with all of you all, and I appreciate you having me.
Thank you so much, Alice. That was a really great overview, and the questions that you raised, I think, are so pertinent to our discussion. So thank you. How about if we have some conversation around some of those questions and Barbora's comments as well. And then Philip, we'd love to hear from you to help us kind of sort through some of the discussion and see if there might be some recommendations too that we could look at. So, well, I guess in a sense, we looked at kind of the supply and the demand side, both in terms of the information environment, especially in regards to NATO. And I think that's extremely useful, certainly since NATO is playing such a central role in our news these days with the war in Ukraine. So definitely this war has raised so many of the issues around news literacy that we're talking about here, with citizens being a first line of defense, and at the same time the perpetrators of disinformation campaigns that are really malignant and definitely damaging. So maybe we could take a look at the idea of, what role could institutions play in addressing these really serious issues that we'll be facing always. Michelle, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I found what Alice said just really, really interesting. The whole balance between protectionism and empowerment, and it has always seemed to me that we are in a cultural lag here, where the technology has far outpaced our legal, societal, social constructs. So I think the question really lies in where is that balance? It seems to me that it's going to be a balance of protectionism and empowerment. Of course, the empowerment is what everybody, that feels much better to do. But when you look at even television, there's an FCC. There are certain times of day that you cannot play certain things. You can't say certain words. You can't have pornography. So is this really where we just haven't yet created the FCC of television for me, you know, the new media?
I think that's such an interesting point, and I absolutely agree. It feels so much that our technology has outpaced our policy and sort of our social norms. And just one point to what you were talking about the balance with protectionist and empowerment. I was thinking, and I failed to mention this, but Barbora, you mentioned that Ukrainians using media and social media to sort of cultivate awareness and support. And I find that so powerful because I feel like that is an example of that sort of creative participation in the information environment and them harnessing their understanding of like messaging and what it means to be able to use it in a positive way. I don't know that that's something we can, maybe that is something we can teach, but I'm not sure that it's something that's policy related. But I actually think it's a really powerful example of how our ecosystem can be used for good, as well as for all of the sort of malignant information that we're sort of protecting against.
If I can jump in here a little bit, I found what both Barbora and Alice and Michelle have said, it just very instructive, very sophisticated, and it really gets to the heart of some of the key issues here. The convening power that NATO has, that Barbora mentioned, is exceptionally important, and it needs to be used just as we're using it really today. But it needs to be used more consistently and more forcefully on this issue, on this distinction between protectionist and empowerment. That is also extremely important, and what is key to that is maintaining the balance. And I think that's what Alice was getting at, is that we don't want to become too defensive, too almost intellectually condescending, saying, be careful now, children out there, don't let the bad guys mislead you. We have to really start taking more a new kind of look at information flow. Because again, as Alice pointed out, we can issue a mandate to act, but we don't know who's supposed to act. And you know, Alice, with your experience with the American education system, I mean, how would you even do it just within the United States? I mean, you can have the president, I suppose, say we need to do something about disinformation, and everybody will pretty much ignore him. And and the same with the Department of Education. So there are structural issues here that certainly need to be addressed. One of the things that, you know, I'm very admiring of President Zelensky, because he understands the power of information. I mean, the whole his approach to this war and to winning worldwide support is based on information. He talks to Ukrainians every night on the media. He talks to the US Congress. He talks to the UN. And as I mentioned in a recent piece I wrote, what we end up with is Zelensky as Churchill and Putin as Putin. And that's not an even match. I mean, Zelensky wins that every time. So we have ongoing illustration of how powerful information is in all this, in this process. What I think we haven't fully grappled with yet is understanding the role of social media as a venue for empowerment. One of the problems has been that when we talk about gatekeepers and filters, which are gone for the most part, and if you look at the history of media gatekeepers, you can say, well, that was more orderly, but is order such a good thing? Social media really dispenses with orderliness to a considerable extent, and we have to learn how to deal with that. Noting today that Elon Musk has said that he is opening up Twitter again to the anti-vaccination and COVID disinformation, that should be a signal to us that beyond purely military matters, beyond the Ukraine case, there are situations developing which should have to be addressed. I mean, the COVID use of Twitter, assuming Twitter survives, which I think it will, use of Twitter as a destructive tool, which certainly is the case when you are disseminating anti-vaccine and other medical disinformation and misinformation, is something that I don't see governments or anyone else, except perhaps in the academy, really grappling with. And that is just, I don't have any cure-all suggestion to make, but I think it's something that when we're talking about all this, we should distinguish among the conventional traditional media and the newer social media, because they really are two different beasts. And it's important we recognize that. I'm just sort of rambling on here, but I think that this idea of empowerment is something that has existed as long as we've been talking about social media in a political context. Empowerment was a term that was used during the Arab uprisings of 2011 and in Egypt, when the use of Facebook and other social media was so important. So it's nothing that is suddenly upon us, but what is suddenly upon us is that we haven't really figured out the sort of the mechanics of tinkering with social media to make social media, the social media themselves, venues for training in information literacy, media literacy. And I think that's part of what the agenda should include, looking to social media as a training venue, and as well as more traditional educational approaches. I'm a big fan in the more traditional side of what Finland has done over the years in terms of keying much of its education system to having a role in information literacy, media literacy. And I thought it was, I came across a quote once from somebody in the Finnish government who said, the kindergarten teacher is our first line of defense. And the fact is that the school curricula embrace critical thinking. And I guess I'll close just by saying critical thinking is something that every teacher would say, well, we do that. But they don't do it well enough. I mean, it has to be expanded. It has to be emphasized more forcefully, because that's really the key. That's what the Finns have done. They introduced critical thinking related to information even in their math classes, as well as in history classes and civics classes and that sort of thing. And so if there's a mandate it really has to be broad enough to pull this whole issue of critical thinking to the forefront of educational work. And Alice, I know you know much more about this than I do. I don't know the current state of the art of critical thinking teaching in American education. I probably know more about the Finnish system than I do about the American system, but it's I think that critical thinking training is something that we should take very seriously as an important part of what we're doing. Okay, I've talked too long. Sorry, Tessa. Here you go.
No, not at all. I think your point's well taken, very much so, Philip, because certainly the critical thinking dimension, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. It isn't taught well. And so that's certainly one of the goals for media literacy education. And Alice, I know with your findings, with the research that you've done around media literacy, I think you were very careful to really delineate around empowerment and how important that is, and you know, to really emphasize the importance of the critical thinking.
Yeah, and in terms of how something like this could work in the United States in terms of like media or news literacy policy, Philip, state by state, it's really different. There are a few states in the US that are seen as leaders in this area. Washington State and Ohio have created state policy that mandates integrating media literacy into the classroom. Of course, we all know the devil's in the details, and implementation of that can vary so much. And then you had mentioned early on, you know, what would a mandate even look like and who would listen? And I think about, I think there are just different levers in different ways, and I don't want to get off on a tangent, but one of the topics that I often study is social and emotional learning. And there's some districts that I've worked with who have actually taken their academic standards, which outline what students should be learning in math and English, et cetera. And they've tried to integrate social and emotional learning into those standards. So that's what the teachers are actually required to base their lessons on. And I think sometimes about what it would look like if we were to do something like that with media literacy. I think there are a lot of different ways that we could approach it, but we're certainly not where Finland is at this point.
For sure. Yes, Barbora.
Perhaps if I may, don't be too upset. I think nobody's where Finland is, even within the EU member states. And believe me, they spend a lot of time. They have so many visitors going to Helsinki, trying to learn from their education system, but somehow it's not that easy to replicate in other countries, simply because it's the whole setup of the whole society. But that's not what I wanted to. But I actually wanted to follow up what Philip said towards the end, that the social media and let's say the traditional media are two very different beasts. And I think this is perhaps one of the problems where legislators and individual governments were perhaps making the mistake of not distinguishing it and properly understanding it. And therefore trying to make legislation or regulation that you would use or be used for traditional media, and try to use the same technique for the social media. And this is perhaps where one of the problems, as you rightly pointed out, comes in. And here maybe I speak as a fellow truth warrior, not a NATO official, but I think that the whole discussion, which I've been witnessing for many years at different fora, is about the sort of regulation of social media content, and how much there was a push that something has to be done, there has to be regulation of the content. And at the end, it was up to the social media platforms themselves to take on that role, which I guess was great first step, but we clearly see the limitations of that. And then we can start discussing, I mean, who has the right to censor me if I want to put out something on my Facebook or Twitter, and whether some AI can actually censor us. And we have had many examples where, because of the languages, because of the slogans, because of the way you use some expressions in different languages, people or users will be banned, or their content would be removed because it was deemed inappropriate, while actually the AI didn't really get the message. And we have seen a lot of it, particularly again in Ukraine, as the example that I know the best, because I worked and lived there for a couple of years. So I think this is one important aspect of how do we do some sort of regulation, which is not outright censorship, but which is not done by the social platforms themselves, and whether, if they do it, whether it's the right, they are the right actors or not. My second point was also then going to the traditional media and the issue of again, oversight and regulatory frameworks. And I give you a very specific example. Russia's Sputnik, for example, which was sort of like a TV, which is funded directly by the Russian government, which they expanded all over the globe in different countries in local languages, providing the Russian viewpoint. And a lot of discussions, especially in the European Union, whether or not we should outright ban Sputnik. And some countries have done it, particularly the Baltic countries. They completely banned Sputnik from their TV options and channels, but some countries have not. Again, do we see, and can we really see, do we have evidence, research, which shows what was the impact if you ban or if you don't ban? What is the impact? Will citizens still look for this information? Will they get it from other sources? So what has been the impact? Did we solve anything with this? You would have some nations which have banned this, arguing that it is now considered part of exactly information warfare, and therefore it's part of the bigger picture of the hybrid warfare, therefore we have to ban it. And then you have some countries which say, well, you know, we have our values, freedom of speech, and this is what makes us different from the others, so we shouldn't ban it. So again, very different approaches, piecemeal approach of each country, but I think it would be also interesting to see what's the end effect and impact. And since we mentioned Finland, this again example where Russia tried to have Sputnik Finland, they operated there, and basically they left. It was not banned by the state, but they packed up and left because they realized that nobody's watching it. So the Finnish citizens just couldn't care less. You could have it on your, you know, TV screen, you could click on it as you choose what you want to watch, but people just didn't because they didn't believe in it. So again, it brings us back to the beginning of my intervention about Finland. So it's just also about trust, about critical thinking, and many other things. And perhaps then we would not need to be banning things and going for censorship, but that's another question. So just a few thoughts.
And I think we shouldn't underestimate the political challenges that are involved when you get into this, even when you're just talking about public education, for example. In the United States, you see what chaos has resulted when we can't decide how to teach about slavery. And we have various states that are pushing back on that. And in France, I think there are issues about teaching about religions in schools there. It's I guess my point is that we should not underestimate how challenging this is going to be. I mean, in democratic countries, everybody's going to have something to say. Everybody's going to see monsters lurking within whatever suggestions we or others make, and we just need to steel ourselves for that and push on as best we can. And that's why I think NATO is so important in all of this, because NATO has standing. It has standing, particularly with regard to the current war in Ukraine, but it also has standing as an international organization, along with the EU and perhaps along with the UN, to get people's attention, at least. Because I think we're sort of outliers, frankly, all of us here talking today, that we are addressing a very real, very important issue. And there's Alice's dog behind her. Very real issue. And yet we are a minority voice. We are a minority voice. We haven't stirred enough public interest except sporadically, and that is something that again we're going to have to deal with. This is going to be a long-term effort that requires a great deal of consistency, a great deal of persistence, and it's going to continue for many years. And I'm not even sure how to grab onto it. To where do we go from here? What's our next step? I don't know. Tessa, that's your expertise.
Well, persistence pays is one thing I would say, because I so agree with you on this being a long-term proposition. You know, media literacy has existed for about 50 years at least, and even in that time, we're really just now at a point where many people even recognize the term, and where there's more of a base of research that we can call upon. So we have an enormous job to do. And when you think about really educating billions of people on the planet, that's enormous. And it is a different way of looking at the world. It's a process of inquiry. It's asking questions. It's being skeptical, but not cynical. So there are values tied to it, which also is a really important key. So here we are, and you know, really we have an important job to do that we need to persist. Yes.
I think another thing on being outliers, it's true, but I don't think we should underestimate how far we've come either. Because yes, it's a 50-year-old discipline, but 50 years ago, we weren't doing webinars with NATO. And now people do understand the term, and it is getting into people's kitchen table thing. There's a lot of work to do, but I think it's important to acknowledge how far we've come as well.
Yes, and Lisa, I saw your hand there. How about asking your question or contributing here?
Yeah, I think I'm very excited about the questions that you proposed, Alice, because I think they're really essential. And so just a little bit about myself. I was a public educator for 20 years, and half of that time I was a teacher librarian here in Los Angeles Unified School District. And I'm currently the education librarian at CSUN. And so I would say, I think one of the best investments that we should be making is in reviving school libraries. So, Alice, you talked a lot about the discrepancy across and I can only speak about United States education system. I'm not at all an expert in other countries, but within the United States, there's really no consistency around policies for requiring teacher librarians, and even the certification process can differ from state to state. So I think that I know in California, again, I'll speak from my point. And California is almost last in the nation as far as the number of teacher librarians per student, the ratio. And it is that equity issue where we have, you see schools in neighborhoods where we have the often underrepresented students, BIPOC students, the lower socioeconomic class students who don't have access to books and libraries are also denied access to libraries. And I think this is the empowerment element. While I understand the concern about wanting to regulate social media, I think that is really not the best approach. But I think through teacher librarians who are specially trained to teach how to navigate the world of information. So this would include all kinds of information literacy, media literacy, general literacy. They are taught to really get into that whole process of what it means to investigate that critical thinking, and they do that across the curriculum. So teacher librarians work with every class so that the students are learning that how we interact with information, how we evaluate information, that process should exist whether I'm looking at something for my own personal information or doing a research paper for English or history or any other class. And by not having those teacher librarians, which over the past decade has been declining in California and I think across the United States, but at the same time we had the rise in media in social media, we've been eliminating and not funding our school libraries. The other aspect to that is the idea of an empowerment is the importance of self-selected reading in building literacy in students. And if I'm assuming most of you are probably familiar with Stephen Krashen's work, and he writes a lot about the importance of this. And the school libraries is essential to that for students to have right there on campus a place where they can read what they want, and that's how we can really help them build literacy and interest in learning and reading. As a teacher librarian, I see over and over when students want reliable information. They don't want to rely on TikTok and Instagram for information. When they really want an answer to a question, they want to know how, but we don't show that to them if we don't have the teacher librarians on campus to teach not only the students, but the teachers about the resources that are out there. So like working in Los Angeles, we have, they have great subscriptions to digital libraries, to databases. And in my years as a teacher librarian, I would do professional development for teachers. And it always shocked me how many teachers who had been working in the district for years did not even know the digital library existed. And that's partly because many of our schools do not have teacher librarians on their campus. So I think that this is, definitely a place where stronger policies about clarifying what a school library program should look like and how it should be funded could really, I think, help us to empower that first line of defense. Because I agree, I think, no matter how much we want to regulate Twitter or any other social media, it's like a Band-Aid to the problem, which is people need to be empowered to navigate and make decisions and be able to evaluate what is valid information or not, and just know how to double check things and get that wider perspective. And that's what they learn in their library programs.
Yes. Well, and what I'm hearing kind of across the board is that this idea about the empowerment of citizens, of really using media literacy type approach to discerning information, but also learning how to responsibly share and communicate. We need to infuse this kind of from top to bottom. All of our institutions are being affected, and yet it's an unaccustomed role. It's something that they really haven't had to look at before in the same way. And now with this open participation, we definitely have, taken the lid off of Pandora's box, and now we're kind of in the midst. But I liked Barbora's point earlier about our really having identified the problem. I think in so many ways we've identified the problem, and now it's almost the question of, well, then what should we be doing? What should our institutions be doing? What's that balance between regulation and empowerment, or protectionism and empowerment? So we have a lot of examination to do that is really going to take us to a totally new place. Do you see changes at NATO, Barbora, in terms of how you're looking at your audiences and how you're looking at the impact of the disinformation?
Yeah, yes, we do. And again, over the years, we have been sort of perfectioning, let's say, our approach to communication. So it's not one fits all, that we look at different audiences. We started collecting polling and data from many other institutions or organizations. And about 2 or 3 years ago, we started doing our own polling to understand a little bit better what are citizens of different countries, but also, you know, different age groups or sort of gender-based, et cetera, so to understand what is it they know about NATO? What is it they think about NATO? Do they support us? Or what concretely they support about NATO? So we have now, I think, collected quite rich data, which we are now trying to work in our communication strategy and communication approaches. Of course, having 30 member states, it's difficult because every country is different. And that we have acknowledged from the very beginning of our work as public diplomacy division, is this understanding that we have different audiences. You cannot compare what, for example, people in Estonia know about NATO and how much they want and need NATO compared to, for example, citizens in Portugal or Spain, where they have very different views on security, threat perception, etc. So we try to tailor some of our communication to these different audiences. Also, we have quite interesting data about based on age. The young people are very much open-minded, as Lisa mentioned. They are curious, they want to know, but it doesn't mean they necessarily support you. That's at least what I find engaging. They are curious, they want to know, they have some very tough questions for us when we engage with them, but that doesn't necessarily translate immediately in support. There is support, it might grow with time, but we can't take it for granted. We have to work with them. The older generations in many countries, much more difficult, of course. And then another very interesting segment that we found that we need to work with, but it's more difficult than you think, is actually female audiences in most of the countries. Women generally, we found out, are not so interested in foreign affairs, let alone security defense issues. They tend to have much lower level of knowledge, but also interest. And then comes the question, okay, so how do we communicate about NATO to them in a language or storytelling that would appeal to them? And that's something that we were discussing a few years ago. Now, interestingly, after the start of the war in Ukraine, it actually slightly changed, where women now are more in favor of NATO because of the collective defense as an aftermath of the war, because they want to protect their families, right? So it's very interesting how these perceptions change based on events. So yeah, we definitely try to do that. We try to look at different aspects and angles. Obviously, it would be nice to have more resources and both human capacity and financial resources, so we can really dig much deeper into this. But I think we at least are trying to adapt our communication in this regard. When it comes to disinformation, Well, we have been part of the discussion pretty much from the start since Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014. I think we have been very quick to jump on this train, and Philip would remember a lot of the discussions we were having, working with our EU colleagues and the partners, including from Ukraine, because NATO was one of the key targets of Russian disinformation immediately after Russia's annexation of Crimea. So we kind of had to get to grips with it and understand what is happening there. So that's also part of our research and that's why I mentioned that we try to improve our capabilities in understanding the information environment of our member states. This is a direct consequence, for example, of these events from 2014 and following up, because unfortunately in some countries we find very high level of, I would say, openness and consumption of disinformation, unfortunately, even today after the start of the war. So this is something we take very seriously.
You know, to follow up on what both Lisa and Barbara were talking about, I'd like to ask Alice about the role of parents. I mean, that seems to me to be a pretty important constituency in terms if we're going to do more within the educational system to teach critical thinking, to teach media literacy itself. Is it realistic to try to target parents as a constituency? Has that been done anywhere about curricular matters, Alice?
I think it's worthwhile to do it, and I know that there are some organizations that have made attempts. I forget who mentioned this. It might have been you, Philip, who said like kindergarten teachers are the first line of defense. And while that's also true, parents, we can start at a very young age asking critical thinking questions, right? So I do think it's worthwhile. The only challenge with that, I mean, of course, from a policy perspective, is that students are coming from all different kinds of households, and some parents are working multiple jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So while I think it's worthwhile to invest in that, I also think that we have to look toward institutions like public education systems to make sure that all students are receiving this kind of education. But certainly think parents have a role to play in it.
Yes. Well, it looks like our time is coming to a close. I certainly appreciate all of the sharing that we've had today. I think the points have just been excellent, and certainly big questions for us to continue to focus on and work toward. So please join us on Friday when we will have another webinar at the same time that will address social and emotional learning and mental health. And so we'll look forward to seeing you then. And I thank all of you so much today to be with us and really appreciate it. All right. Take care. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.